So, my name is Newt Nadelhofer, and I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. My favorite job, however, is being director of the biological station, where I live from mid-May through August, and I get up here as much as I can September through April. But it is so great to see so many people here. I think we'll try to request funds from the college to build a balcony if we keep filling the stage, filling the seating capacity. So my words will be brief. It's been a pleasure having Richard Prum on campus for the past couple of days. We've shown him around. We've met him. He's a tremendously interesting person. I'm going to let Jordan Price introduce him in a minute, but I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank everybody, too, for establishing a great tradition of these talks. Everybody's welcome here. Everybody's more than encouraged to participate in our conversations. And what I've been very happy to see in our seminars so far is nobody turns a device on. We're all talking with each other, and we're all listening. And I think that's incredibly valuable and respectful of not only the speaker, but everyone here. So thank you. I had to learn how to turn off my Apple Watch just now. So I'm in it with you. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Those of you who visited from outside the station should know you're more than welcome to come to these events, other advertised events. And not only that, you're welcome to walk our trails, watch, they're not our birds, but watch birds. Enjoy the lakeshore, enjoy the habitats, help us keep the place pristine and useful and valuable. So without any further words from me, I'd like to invite Dr. Jordan Price to the podium. Jordan has been teaching evolution here for a number of years, and he's a colleague and friend of Rick Prum, so he is the one to introduce Rick to you all. So thank you, Jordan.
So the introduction of the introducer. It's really my great honor to introduce Dr. Rick Prum, who's visiting us from Yale University, who is our Hann Endowed lecturer in ornithology. And I have to say a few things about the lecture itself. And again, I'm Jordan Price. I'm a teaching faculty here at the station. So the lecture is named after Dr. Harry Hann, who received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1926. And then he went on to become a faculty member at the U of M until 1956. And he was an ornithologist, among other things, and his studies of cowbirds and ovenbirds are really considered classics. And he and his wife passed away actually a few days apart in 1965. And his descendants set up this endowment for this talk ever since then. So we're grateful for that. So before I bring Dr. Prum to the stage, I wanted to just say a few words about him. So I've known Rick Prum, or known of Rick Prum for many years. I've been friends with his graduate students and his postdocs since I was a graduate student, but it wasn't really until about 10 years ago that we first had our first real professional interaction, where he was a reviewer on a paper that I was trying to publish. He was reviewer number 2 of this paper, and if you're a scientist, you know a little bit about reviewer number 2. It was a paper actually I wrote just over in Lakeside Labs actually. If you don't know, scientists, when we try to publish things, we volunteer to be peer reviewers for each other's work, and we critically evaluate this work, and sometimes these evaluations are really constructive, and sometimes they're more challenging, and sometimes it's like getting a colonoscopy. So Rick was reviewer number 2, which is often the more difficult reviewer. And his review was sort of unusual. It was different. It was, I actually had to go back and look it up. And he didn't list all the problems with the work. He didn't criticize our value as human beings and scientists. He In fact, his review was really encouraging. It turns out that Rick Prum is a really awesome guy. And he well, actually, look at it here. He pointed out that the patterns that we found in our paper were not consistent with how most scientists assumed that colors and other animal displays evolved, and he really encouraged us to think differently about this. He said we seem to hesitate to deal with the actual consequences of our results, and he urged us to be bolder and to go farther. And that's what we did, actually. It was a student of mine and we just completely rewrote this paper, and it made it much harder to publish, actually. But it totally changed my perspective. Actually, from that point on, it really changed the way I viewed evolution, and it changed the way I taught. It really changed my research, actually, from that point on. So now, 10 years later, I'm happy to say that other people are enjoying the same experience, I think, reading Rick Prum's wonderful new book that I think is changing a lot of people's perspective about how they view the world and evolution in particular. So a little bit about Rick. He is the William Robertson Co-Professor of Ornithology at Yale University, and he's curator of ornithology and head curator of vertebrate zoology at the Peabody Museum of Natural History. He has been a Fulbright Scholar. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow. More recently, he's been a MacArthur Fellow, which, if you didn't know this, is a really, really big deal. I didn't count his publications or anything, but his publications span 9.5 single-spaced pages on his CV. He's world-renowned not just for his ideas about sexual selection and aesthetics, but for his research on color perception and the nanostructure of color production, the evolutionary origins of feathers, for assembling one of our best and most comprehensive phylogenies of birds more recently. So you can talk to him about all of these topics. He does all kinds of research. He got his undergraduate degree, before arriving at Yale in 2004, he was a member of the University of Kansas, and before that he was a Chapman Fellow at the American Museum of Natural History. He got his undergraduate degree from Harvard, and I assume that Yale dissuades you from telling people that. But we all know that he owes most of his success to the training he got as a PhD student at the University of Michigan. This is his first visit to UMBS. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Prum.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jordan. Thanks to the station. It's a pleasure to be the Hann lecturer this year, and it's a pleasure to be here for the first time. I blew through here, this area of the state, on bird watching trips when I was an undergrad, or when I was a grad student in Ann Arbor. But I was so busy going to South America looking for manakins that I never had the opportunity to spend a summer here. I had the good fortune to once to be introduced at a talk by Jim Watson, the co-discoverer of DNA, structure of DNA and genetic code. And it turns out that William Robertson Coe was a really rich guy, the guy who donated the money to Yale. But at that point, he married into the Rogers family, who was Rockefeller and Rogers, started Standard Oil. So they were among the richest people in the world. He had several interests among ornithology, the American West, and right-wing politics of the most extreme flavor. And he gave this money to Yale, and then America quickly taxed him into, or his family after he died. Anyway, his house was a museum in Long Island. The family couldn't keep it up. So the foundation invited the co-professor to speak at the Coe family estate, which is now a state park. And it turns out that Watson's wife is on the board because she's very interested in period decorating. So Watson got up there, and I'd never met him before, and he said, "I've always thought that there are only two things worth studying: genetics
and ornithology. Now, as you know, Watson is a very opinionated guy, but this is one opinion I never thought that I would hear from him. It turns out that as a young person interested in biology, he started as a bird watcher first. And he came up here and took an ornithology class at Douglas Lake from, I think, Olin Pettingill back in the day. And he expressed that his mother really encouraged his interest in birds and actually was a little disappointed that he got into this genetics thing. He left the bird part. Anyway, so this place had lots of influence on lots of different biologists, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to introduce today's topic by talking about this as a bird watching science. And by that I mean a particular kind of natural history informed science. That's not a hard sell here at UMBS, but I think that it's still an important point to make. You know, Ernst Rutherford, a famous physicist in the early 20th century, said that all science is either physics or stamp collecting. And this is actually one of the more famous put-downs in the history of science, right? And I have to admit that my entire career in ornithology is dedicated to proving Rutherford to be correct, but to revolutionizing the way people think about stamp collecting. Because stamps are actually individuals. They're issued at a certain moment in time. They're issued in certain countries at certain times and places, right? And stamp collecting, when the objects of that collection are natural objects, engages with an entirely new kind of discipline. And so birdwatching science, natural history, is really the science of individuals and individuality. Individuals like this Blackburnian warbler, which is the member of a certain species and has a certain plumage, has a certain age, is at a certain point in his life, right? But it's not just about individual organisms like you and me. It's about individuality as a general topic. So there are all sorts of other kinds of individuals in science, like homologs, like my limb and the bird wing and a bat wing. Or, if you will, branches on the tree of life, what we call clades, like birds or reptiles or vertebrates or plants. These are all individuals. By individuals, I mean an entity that has a birth, a thriving, a potential reproduction, and an inevitable end, right? The interesting thing about the science of individuals is that individuals don't follow laws. They have contingency. They have historical events that influence the outcome. And so stamp collecting is really about the science of individuality. Right? Now, as a scientist, I think hypothesis testing is a great tool. I use it all the time. However, I don't think that it's a great definition of science, right? Because it eliminates the science of individuality, things like evolutionary history itself, right? And so, as a result, birdwatching science is built on a foundation of natural history, and it's these kinds of institutions that keep that tradition alive in the sciences in a living way. So the more you know about evolutionary biology, the more likely it is that you will disagree with me today. And so as a result, I'm going to start by appealing shamelessly to your, to earn your trust. I'm going to start at the beginning with this. Yes, that's little Ricky Prum in 6th or 7th grade, school picture day. This picture is embarrassing for many reasons, but I'll just focus on the glasses, right? You know, they may be retro in Brooklyn today, but back then they were not, right? That's what you put a kid in, glasses in those days. But the glasses are actually the focus of this picture in another big way, because I got my first pair of glasses in 4th grade. And within months, I was a bird watcher. And in some way that I didn't understand then, I knew what I would be doing now, which was some sort of a bird-filled life, right? And I actually, now if somebody shows, a young person shows a lot of interest, you bury them with resources and information. But back then, there's like, hey, Ricky's into birds, cool, you know? And I sort of went feral, not knowing what science was, but knowing somehow when you create a life list as a bird watcher, there's something about it, the word life. And it stretches out ahead of you in a to-be-determined way, but with some details that are certain, right? Which is that your life will be engaged with birds, right? And so basically I've rolled out on this path, and now I'm unfit for any other kind of employment. And luckily there's a place where they put people like me, and you know, it's universities, right? And in my case, museums. So it was when I got to Harvard that I understood or discovered that evolution was the area of evolutionary biology, or the area of biology that was about what I found so fascinating, which was the origin and maintenance of biodiversity, their differences, why they live where they live, their histories, and their behaviors and such. So I soon became engaged in trying to combine my interest in phylogenetics with my bird watching, which led to my dissertation at Michigan. This is me during my dissertation recording birds in the Andes of Ecuador. And that's led over the years to now my very messy office where somehow science gets produced. So Jordan kindly described some of the research I've been doing, and it's been a great ride. Over the years, I always thought that the stuff I did was just weird stuff that Rick is into. I had no need of a worldview or any kind of central focus. And yet, recently, I've discovered that a lot of what I've been working on is about one fundamental and important topic: the evolution of beauty. And by beauty, I don't mean the beauty that we perceive, the beauty that has motivated me to look at birds like this cotinga and to study the nanostructures in the feathers that make the blue, or the unique carotenoids that make those purple colors. I mean beauty to the birds themselves, and to the scientific concept that birds are beautiful because they are beautiful to themselves, right? And that they are active agents in their own evolution, right? Now, to get things started, I want to start with the challenge, describing the challenges of avian beauty. This is a superb bird of paradise. This is a polygynous species. This is the male. The female is about to arrive on the log and visit him. She does all the nesting, produces all the reproduction, and he contributes only sperm to reproductive effort. He does this display for her as she arrives on the log. So what we have here is an incredible, these are photonic nanostructures. They're surrounded by super black feathers. These are structurally absorbing feathers. We just described the structure of them in Nature Communications earlier this year. Right? And then we have the feather shapes, the muscles that erect the feathers, the display, and the mechanical snaps he's making with his wings. And you can watch him, he's still breathing for a while here. But here we have the challenge. The first challenge, of course, is to the magnitude of beauty. What evolutionary theory can explain that extremity? And then we have this other problem, which is that most of my colleagues in evolutionary biology believe that beauty like this evolves because it communicates practical information that mates need to know. Like, who are his people? Does he come from a good egg? Does he have a good diet? Right? Does he take care of himself? Is he going to take care of my babies? Does he smoke? Or what is he smoking? These are all things that mates might want to know. And in this worldview, beauty is just another kind of utility. It's another path to becoming better or being better, right? Now, somehow or other, the way in which I connected my birdwatching history, my natural history experience, to the science of ornithology and evolution have led me to become interested in an entirely different perspective, right? One that beauty can evolve because of the pleasure that it produces, right? Now, in this aesthetic evolution, that as I call it, the subjective experiences of animals become the core focus of our study. What the early ethologists called the Umwelt, the surrounding sensory constructed world. So we have a whole bunch of different vertebrates here which have very different sensory experiences. The bat, which constructs a three-dimensional sonar world, the olfactory world of the mole, the more mirrored fish, which lives in murky waters in African rivers, that senses the world with electrical fields, and then also sings electrical songs that vary in frequency and tempo, like music, but in another kind of wave, right? These are all stunningly different kinds of constructions of the world. Now, the bird, on the other hand, communicate with color and with acoustics, with song. Both of these sensory modalities that are richly important to humans. And so it's not surprising as a young birdwatcher in southern Vermont, or as a young, science-eager natural historian, that I gravitated to these as opposed to some of these other groups. In any case, in order to become a science, I need to put this on a scientific footing. So I'm going to describe aesthetic evolution as an emergent consequence of three things: sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice. And when these choices are made on the basis of a heritable substrate, either cultural or genetic, then there's a new kind of mode of evolution, where the functions of the products of this process function in the brains, in the perceptions, in the cognitive evaluations of other organisms, right? So in order to bring beauty back into the sciences as a legitimate focus of scientific study, I also need to put it on an appropriate defined frame. And so aesthetic philosophers from Kant all the way through the moderns have been, or from the Greeks through Kant and the moderns, have been challenged to describe what beauty is. So I describe beauty not as mere attraction, but as a co-evolved attraction, in which the form of the desire and the objects of desire have shaped one another over time through interactions, and those are going to be evolutionary interactions, right? And that's given rise to all these diversity of beauty, from the sexual ornaments of the wood thrush and the cock of the rock, the social ornaments of the blue jays, the baby birds, the evolution of cuteness, right? To floral beauty, right? Which are all the product of animal choices. Now, this science is not new. In fact, it goes back straight to Charles Darwin, in many ways the originator of modern evolutionary science. Now, Darwin, after writing The Origin of Species, had a number of persistent, incorrigible problems. He had no theory of genetics or heritability. He had no articulated theory of the origin of human diversity. And he had no theory of what he called the origin of impracticable beauty. So he wrote to Asa Gray, after the publication of The Origin in 1859, he wrote a few years later, "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." And I think you'll agree, if that picture, that Darwin looks a little sick, doesn't he? Yeah, he was kind of a sickly guy, right? A warrior. He took his intellectual concerns and turned them inward. Well, but instead of resting on his laurels as just on the basis of origin, he certainly would have been known as perhaps the most successful biologist or the successful scientist of the century. And yet he wheeled around in a foxy way, and he came up with another alternative, distinct mechanism of the evolutionary mechanism, which he called sexual selection. And it included two parts. One was mating competition, often male-male competition, over opportunities for mating or control for opportunities of mating, giving rise to armaments or instruments of control, right? And then his other half of sexual selection was mate choice. The choice of mates of one sex by the other sex, based on their evaluations. Now, we'll focus entirely today on mate choice. But what's interesting is Darwin's language for describing mate choice was explicitly aesthetic. He described mating preferences as an aesthetic faculty, a taste for the beautiful, or as standards of beauty. And he also said the most refined beauty may serve as a sexual charm and for no other purpose. And by this he means no adaptive purpose. So Darwin defined sexual selection as a distinct form, a distinct evolutionary mechanism, right? Darwin's theory of sexual selection was also co-evolutionary. That is, he envisioned the ornaments and preferences co-evolving, shaping one another over time, right, through their interactions. So here's a passage about the Argus pheasant that we'll see in a few minutes. The male Argus acquired his beauty gradually through the preference of females during many generations for more highly ornamented males. The aesthetic capacity of females advanced through exercise or habit, just as our own taste is gradually improved. Now again, he shows his ignorance of any kind of heritability or genetics, but this is exactly the kind of characterization that is considered to be sort of brilliantly prescient when it's applied to natural selection. Right, so a lot of these details. Well, Darwin's concept that male-male competition structured in some important way the structure, the natural world, was a big winner. That was so congruent with the Victorian worldview that it was actually, I think, went a long way to contributing to the success of evolutionary biology as a concept. But his idea of mate choice, particularly female mate choice, was a force in nature, was a big loser. It was a bomb, right? And it was critiqued in a general way in many forms. And many of those early critiques were explicitly misogynistic. That is, we couldn't imagine that female animals would have this capacity. In particular, they also couldn't imagine that the psychology of animals was complex enough to make such judgments. Well, there were many critics, but the most successful and ardent critic of the idea of sexual selection was Alfred Russel Wallace. This is the co-discoverer of the theory of adaptation by natural selection. Now, Wallace said many interesting and actually nutty things. So, for example, he said that if you open up the animal, the viscera, the liver and the kidneys and the spleen are all brilliantly colored. So if you look at a peacock, that's just the same thing, but on the outside. Right? It's just the vigor of the animal expressing itself. And that what we really need to talk about is the evolution of drabness through natural selection, right? But he was never able to eliminate sexual selection by mate choice entirely. And when he acknowledged it, we see something very interesting, which he states that in Natural Selection Neutralizing Sexual Selection, a section of a book he wrote, he says, the only way we can account for the observed facts is by supposing that color and ornament are strictly correlated with health, vigor, and general fitness to survive. Now, this is fascinating because Wallace is credited with having killed sexual selection for an entire century. His critique was so devastating. And yet here he is articulating exactly the idea that is the foundation of almost all research in sexual selection today. How did that happen? Well, it turns out that this idea led him to the following conclusion, which is, if there is, as I maintain, such a correlation, then sexual selection for color and ornament, for which there's little or no evidence, becomes needless, because natural selection, which is the admitted true cause, vera causa, will produce all the results. So he called this process natural selection, and therefore we don't need sexual selection. What was he rejecting? What he was rejecting was the aesthetic, the idea that animals could make choices, free choices, right? Now, as I mentioned, Wallace's critique was devastating, and it took more than a century, or it took basically a century till 1970s for the science to fully incorporate sexual selection. And when it did so, it incorporated it in Wallacean, entirely Wallacean terms. Now, Darwin and Wallace debated on this until Darwin's death in 1883. And then 6 years later, Wallace published the book Darwinism, in which he said that in the introduction, even in rejecting that phase of sexual selection depending on female choice, I insist upon the greater efficacy of natural selection. This is preeminently the Darwinian doctrine, and I therefore claim for my book the position of being the advocate of pure Darwinism. So here Darwin's been dead for 6 years, and Wallace is claiming to be more Darwinian than Darwin. Now it's 130 or more years later, and I'm still pissed about it. And I hope that you are too. Because in fact, what happened was that we have been denied both the science and the culture at large, the actual richness of Darwin's own view. And what we've inherited is a narrowed, dumbed down, or flattened view of Darwin's actual complexity. Darwinism, as coined now, is actually a form of what I call adaptationism. The idea that adaptation is a strong force that dominates all the interesting things in evolution, which is not Darwinian in the slightest. So although Wallace lost credit, I think appropriately, for the creation or for the discovery of the idea of adaptation by natural selection, he won the war over what evolutionary biology would become in the 20th century, which is overwhelmingly an adaptationist field, a field dominated by this one powerful idea. And so part of the mission of the book is to resurrect this Darwinian view and hopefully enrich the complexity of evolutionary biology as a result. Now, at this point in my seminars in an academic context, I would veer off into population genetics. And actually, fortunately, I have some time, so I'm going to be giving a second talk tomorrow with more nitty-gritty details. So those of you who want to get under the hood and see how this works can join me tomorrow. But now I hope to give you an easy analogy to compare the Wallacean and the Darwinian view. So how does this work? Well, I'm going to compare the value of beauty to the value of money, right? And where does the value of money come from? Well, in the old days, under the gold standard, the value of money existed because every dollar stood in lieu of a tiny piece of gold in Fort Knox. If you were skeptical, you could actually turn in your dollars for gold, and as a result, nobody did because the dollar was backed by the gold. Under this worldview, or under this kind of economic system, the value of money is extrinsic. It's not in the dollar, it's in the gold. Don't ask why gold is valuable. Now, over the last century, people have been gradually abandoning the gold standard so that now every currency on the planet, from dollars to Bitcoin and everything else in between, has abandoned the gold standard. There's no longer any gold. So where does the value of money come from? The value of money comes from in the fantastic description of Paul Samuelson, an economist. The value of money is a social contrivance. It arises because we agree that dollars have value. There's no gold, right? In this worldview, the value of the dollar is intrinsic. It's in the dollar. It's just the dollar. There's no gold, right? So the Wallacean view, and that held by most of the people in evolutionary biology, is that nature is on the gold standard. The peacock's tail, or that beautiful bird of paradise, or that wood thrush song is beautiful and evolves to be beautiful because it stands in lieu of something else of value, extrinsic values, like good genes or direct benefits, like is he going to feed my babies with more food, or is the territory better, right? It's all about getting better. The Darwinian view is like Bitcoin or modern money. It's a social contrivance, and what I'll talk about tomorrow is some of the details of how it's contrived genetically, right? So what that means is that my evolutionary colleagues are on the gold standard. They're like gold bugs who think that every deviation from this Wallacean orthodoxy is like an irrational flight from reason. And you turn on the TV and you go to certain channels, you can see one of these guys on just about any day talking about fiat money and all that, right? Just so you know, my evolutionary colleagues are on the same plane. Here's a good example. Alan Graffin, critic of Fisher process, published in 1990, to believe in the Fisher-Landy process as an abundant or as an explanation of sexual selection without abundant proof is methodologically wicked. Now, there are a lot of ideas in science that have been panned over the years, cold fusion, etc., but they're not being described as methodologically wicked. So this idea, which comes straight out of Darwin, is so dangerous that it's been characterized as wicked by core members of the evolutionary field, right? And I think that's the kind of exaggeration you see in the economic front in response to gold bugs, right? So now, in my academic work, I've described some of the background, and those papers are robustly cited. Unfortunately, with the exception of Jordan and a few other people, nobody cites them for their contents. They just cite them as, if you want to mention this process, you start to, and then there's Prum, always over there. And then they go on and do what they want to do. But so I in the book, I've been trying to rebrand that, and I call it Beauty Happens. And what I mean is that when you have sensory engagement or sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice, then beauty will evolve, right? Now, how do we progress in science? How do we know if the Wallacean or the beauty happens is the right approach? Well, I'm going to use another analogy, and there's going to be gold in it too. I'm going to compare Alfred Russel Wallace, or the Wallacean view, to a leprechaun, right? Because indeed, the honest advertisement path is that the peacock is not intrinsically beautiful, that its beauty is really about something else. It's So what that means is that the tail is like a rainbow leading to a pot of gold. And it's laden with good genes. Yeah. Watson would be happy about that. There's a and direct benefits, right? And so in order to understand how I would propose we progress in science, ask yourself, is the beauty of the rainbow intrinsic or extrinsic? Where's the value of the rainbow come from? Is it in the gold, or is there no gold? Right? Well, if a leprechaun comes up to you and tells you that there's a pot of gold at the end rainbow, the answer is, show me the money, right? The burden of proof is on the leprechaun, right? The null model, our null expectation in nature is that there's no gold, right? And so that means that the Darwinian view, the Fisherian view, in which beauty is an arbitrary, co-evolved form of attraction and communicates nothing about quality, is our expectation of the world. And the special hypothesis is the Wallacean one. And so I hope by putting the leprechaun hat at Alfred Russel Wallace, you will never be able to forget this idea. Right? Okay. Well, back to nature. Let's examine whether these complexity of beauty can withstand this test. This is the Argus pheasant, this is actually filmed in a zoo in Indonesia. And you can see that he's pretty extraordinary. He's about 6 feet long. And right now he's mostly sort of vermiculated drab brown. There's the female there. And again, this is another polygynous species. She does all the nesting. The male does these displays. Now, here it is in a zoo, so she actually can't get away from him right here. But as you'll see in a moment, in his display, he transforms himself in an unimaginably complex way, right? Now, these are actually the secondary feathers attached to the ulna. And this is the primary feathers. You can see the tail. In a moment, we'll see how he's pumping on his back legs and the tail, right? Now, here she is engaged with this. Now, the first Western scientist to see this in the wild was William Beebe. He was working on pheasants for most of his career. By the way, there's his head behind the wing there, peering in through the gap. And he was obsessed with the evolution, as Darwin was, with the evolution of these eye spots, which have this white highlight on the top and a dark smudge below, which gives the impression of a three-dimensional golden ball, right? And these white smudges like this specular highlight that shows you that an apple is round, right? And the black smudge is like the shadow cast by the object. Well, Beebe struggled to see this bird in the wild, and he first built a blind by the display site, and the male abandoned. Then he went to another display site and built a tree house, and that male abandoned. Then finally he had his workers dig a foxhole in the ground and observe the males from underneath a pile of brush. So we got in this hole every day before dawn and got covered with brush and waited in there for a week until he saw this display. Right? And then in the end, he concludes, well, I would like to believe Darwin's idea, but I'm sure that whatever aesthetic impact of that display is entirely wasted on that little hen. So here it was in the 1920s and 30s, and he was resurrecting the same kind of misogynistic language of the original, right? And indeed, he imagined, of course, he's having a religious experience in the foxhole, having fought the leeches and the flies, and what is she doing? She's cold, she's curious, she's just like regarding. And of course, I think what happened was a kind of inverse or reverse anthropomorphism. He expected her to show some of the kind of emotion that he was experiencing. But in fact, it's her acute decisions that have led to this evolution, right? It's really her that's driven it. Behind every elaborate ornament in nature, there's an equally elaborate and co-evolved cognitive concept of beauty. So I think the better thing would be to compare her to a museum curator or to a collector at an exhibit. Are they weeping to see the art? No, they're standing back going, oh, is that good? They're thinking about it, right? Indeed, if we look at the sexual success in these species, what we find is that the distribution of sexual success is like the income distribution in America today. That is, 5%, 1% of the males are getting 50% of the copulations. Then the next 10% of the males are dividing up another 30, 40. And then half of the males are never mating in their lives. right? So this means that this kind of beauty evolves through an extremity of failure, right? And which is extraordinary, right? That means, that's a little bit like explaining why most poems that have ever been written really suck, right? And operas too, right? I mean, most operas are never performed, never be performed again. Why? Because the stringency of success, the stringency of evaluation of those products is so extraordinary that when they succeed in an amazing kind of emergent way, right? And so this kind of beauty evolves and co-evolves because of extremity of failure, and that's part of the equation. So here we can see this in detail. There's the white highlight, the black smudge. It gives the optical illusion of three-dimensionality. But that's not, it's like Ronco ad. Well, wait, there's more, right? And then here we have a feather showing that the spheres scale with the size of the feather. That could be simple allometry, right? The feather gets bigger, the balls get bigger. But in fact, if you look at it in a foreshortened way from the perspective of the female, you see that they converge on the largest spheres are the ones that are furthest away from her. And they all converge on the same size. So it's like 300 golden balls of the same size, suspended in a blown-out umbrella over her head, right? So that's extreme. And I think this is the kind of, there's so many dimensions to this complexity that is the kind of beauty that is really hard for the adaptive model to explain. Now I'm going to be focusing on a lot of aesthetically extreme birds. And these are birds in which the female does all the nesting and chooses among the available males who do the splice. Now these are the kinds of species that lead to the most extreme ornaments. But I just want to emphasize at this point that there's lots of other breeding systems in birds. The broader field of behavioral ecology shows us that depending on the distribution of the resources and phylogenetic history and seasonality, you can have other sorts of things. So there's a whole bunch of birds that are monomorphic brilliant, right? So the gallinule, the puffin, the flamingos, these are all birds in which both males and females are making mate choices, and they both have ornaments with the same preferences, right? They're choosing each other, giving rise to sort of beauty that's shared. And then there are species where the female, polyandrous species, where the female declares a territory and then attracts, if she's successful, multiple males. The males are making mate choices. So in these species, the females are brighter, larger in body size. In some species, they even have weapons and are armed that they use in fights, right? So these are polyandrous. So all sorts of other sorts of things. Now, one of the birds that I've been studying quite a bit over the years are the manakins. And they're a kind of what I call aesthetic radiation, which is a purposeful rip-off or alternative to adaptive radiation. Radiation and beauty. This is the clubwing manakin, and that little tick-tick wang sound that it's making, that little buzz, is a special kind of song, because this bird is singing with his wings. As he moves his wings, he's creating that sound. Now, I first saw this bird as my first summer in Ecuador in 1984, or 1985, as a student in Michigan. And it took us 20 years to figure it out, and how it made it. Well, and this is the work of Kim Bostwick, now at Cornell, also married to the guy who studies birds of paradise. They met in my lab back in Kansas. and here's a high-speed movie showing how these feathers are oscillating over the back. And it's called, and that's at 100 cycles per second. So we need to multiply that by 1,400 or 15 to get 1,500 hertz, the sound figure. And so these clubwing manakins get their name from these secondary feathers. So again, another weird secondary. They're thickened in this fashion. And the fifth secondary leans over and rubs against these bumps on the sixth secondary and rubs like a violin bow. As the feathers oscillate, the tip of this feather rubs up and down on the ridges of that feather, creating a mechanical impulse which causes that feather to ring at the frequency of the sound. This is what we call stridulation, which is the same mechanism that crickets use to make sounds. And this is a unique thing in birds. So it's fascinating to show that beauty can be innovative. Birds have been singing songs for 60, 80 million years, maybe more, with a syrinx, the vocal organ, and yet this bird has abandoned that tradition to go into an entirely new kind of acoustic advertisement. Well, in subsequent work, Kim studied something that was really fascinating. Is beauty only skin deep, right? And here she is. This is a CAT scan of a clubbing manakin. There's the whole specimen. This is actually a UMMZ specimen. And here's a single section through the torso. What you can see is that the humerus, the radius, and the ulna are all solid, like ivory. Now that's a big deal because every flying bird on the planet has hollow wing bones. Heck, even Velociraptor and T-Rex have hollow wing bones or hollow limb bones. This is a feature that evolved before birds and before the evolution of flight, right? So this is a major transformation. Now, indeed, when she looks at these, here's other ulnas of other manakins, and then the clubwing manakin, right? This is the typical flute-like ulna, and this monstrosity. It's almost unrecognizable as the same bone, right? And it has a series of quill knobs for the attachment of the secondary feathers, which make the sound. And Kim showed that the density of calcium in this thing is orders of magnitude greater than in these closely related manakins, right? So this is clearly a kind of cost, a tremendous cost. It makes it harder for this guy to fly and harder for him to survive. But, you know, it's worth it because this is the cost of beauty. You know, he's making those beautiful sounds that females like. Well, these costs could be interpreted as a handicap, which I'll describe more tomorrow, but that's the idea that the investment in the cost is what reinsures the honesty. So I wanted to examine that hypothesis by looking at female clubwings. What are their ulnas like? To make a long story short, they're not solid, but they have the same elaborate and distinctive structure, right? So this is interesting because the female is paying some of the costs of sexual display, yet she is never going to sing a song. She will never benefit. How can that work? It turns out that one of the reasons why this evolves is that the wing bones, or the bones of birds, begin development in the egg before the embryo becomes either male or female, before sexual differentiation starts. So it's impossible for the female to select on males to get these ulnas without transforming her own wing bones. What does this mean? I call this the evolution of decadence, right? That this is the way in which sexual selection makes everybody in the species worse off, right? So when the female chooses this male that makes the beautiful songs that she likes, right? Her male offspring will inherit the weird wing bones and the capacity to sing those beautiful wing songs. But her daughters will also inherit weird wing bones, which will make them worse off. They're costly to make, and they probably are more difficult to fly with. But these costs to her daughter's survival fecundity are traded off by the advantages of having sexually attractive male offspring. So this is a case where every choice makes the species worse off, right? Now I was talking to a journalist about this last year when the book came out, and he said, "Wow, you seem really delighted by that prospect." And I said, "Well, maybe a little bit." But so why is this important? It's important because when we see that natural selection and sexual selection are running in exactly opposite directions, that the importance of Darwin's distinction between natural and sexual selection as distinct forms, and we see the problem of the Wallacean view, right? So. Now, this whole section has been about aesthetic agency of animals, how animals are forces in their own evolution. But I want to conclude with a couple comments about another aspect. And this is work that I never imagined I'd be doing. I started working on duck sex because of Patty Brennan, who was an enterprising postdoc that wanted to work on the evolution of avian genitalia. And I thought to myself, wow, I've never worked on that end of the bird before. I'm sure that I'll learn a lot. But what I learned really transformed my view of evolutionary biology in a fundamental way. And this is the difficult topic of essentially sexual coercion and sexual violence and its consequences in animals, right? And the reason I think we were prepared to make these discoveries is because by taking the aesthetic view, you take the subjective experiences of animals seriously as individuals. And so it's only by doing that we're in a position for the first time to ask, what happens when female choices are infringed or abridged by sexual coercion and sexual violence? And unfortunately, duck sex has a lot of violence in it. And so that's where we're headed. But the payoff is big. So the breeding system of ducks is a lot like most birds. The females choose males on the basis of co-evolved preferences for ornaments, including the green head and the quack, quack, quack that Kim's like. But as they move toward the breeding season and toward the breeding grounds, troubles begin. Males who are unpaired often coerce or force themselves sexually in forced copulations on females. It is very damaging. They can be injured. They can even be killed. Right? Now, this is all made possible by the fact that ducks have a penis. Now, this is unusual. We don't usually think of birds as having a penis, but it turns out that the penis evolved in the common ancestor of reptiles and mammals. So the duck penis is actually homologous with the human penis, but is really weird. One of the ways in which it can be really weird is that it can be really long. This is the Guinness Book of World Records holder for the biggest penis. This is the Argentine lake duck with a penis longer than the duck. And it does just happen on other continents. This is the ruddy duck with a penis that's equivalent to and ornamented, right? I have discovered in my work on duck sex that duck sex is like a gas. It expands to fill whatever volume you put it in, right? And so we're going to have to keep it a little limited here, but I do need to introduce a little bit about the duck penis. So it turns out that it's counterclockwise coiled, right? It's stored outside in the cloaca most of the time. It has lymphatic erection instead of blood vascular, which means that the erection is very, very rapid. It does not become stiff, but essentially intromission and erection are the same processes. It does not have a urethra, an enclosed tube. It has an outer groove called the sulcus, you can see here. And it comes in smooth, ribbed, toothy, and thorny varieties, right, which we'll learn more about. Now, in science, we aim to change lives, right? But this next slide will change your life. If you don't want your life changed, you better close your eyes or try to. This is a high-speed movie of a duck penis erecting, which we took at a duck farm in California. And so it's only 20 seconds long, but it's a third of a second. So there's the male, and there's female, and here it starts everting like an inverted sweater sleeve, and it comes out. That's a third of a second. And you can see at the end here that the sulcus works just fine. Thank you. And that was actually under scientific debate. I want to remind you here that we're using the metric side of the ruler. So this is science, okay? This really is science. Like, there we are. Those are international units. Well, it's remarkable that it took until 2010 for this to be described, something that was notable to farmers probably for millennia, and probably informed the Greek myth of Leda and the Swan, right? So, but there was still a lot of science to do, right? So, well, what did Patty discover? Well, what Patty discovered is that as a result of forced copulation in the ducks, there's an interesting pattern of what we call antagonistic coevolution, an arms race in duck genitalia. So in species with no forced copulation, the intromittent organ, the penis of males is rudimentary and small, and the vaginal morphology is very simple. But in species with lots of forced copulations, right, the penis becomes large and complicated, and so does the vagina. And if we look at that in more detail, we see that the first complexity is a series of dead-end cul-de-sac, pouches, side pockets off of the vaginal lumen, off of the passageway. And then above that, we have a series of clockwise spirals, anti-sense to the counterclockwise spirals. So what we proposed, and I think came close to demonstrating, is that ducks have evolved an anti-screw device in their vaginal morphology, right? We were able to test that with these glass tubes, so one of my favorite passages in the book to write was the description of going to the Yale glassblowing shop and telling them that we wanted to make artificial vaginas for ducks. What we have is a straight tube, all the same diameter, male-like, female-like, clockwise, and then a dead-end cul-de-sac. What we showed is that the penis erects just fine into these and failed to erect completely over 80% of the time in those. So these structures function to exclude the penis during forced copulations, right? So what we discovered is that what that Tea Party Senate candidate Todd Akin from Missouri said about women have a way of shutting that whole thing down about rape in humans is true of ducks. But it's true in a way that we would not expect. And what it shows is that freedom of choice, sexual autonomy matters to animals. there is something it is like to have freedom of choice, and that there are evolutionary consequences to its failure or to its abridgment, right? So how does this work? Well, when the female chooses the male she likes, then her male offspring inherit the green head and the quack, quack, quack that she prefers, which is also, because of coevolution, evolved to be the aesthetic norm within the species. But when she's forcibly fertilized, her offspring will inherit genes of either a random male or one that she's explicitly rejected, which means that they will be less likely to be sexually attractive to other females in the population. So aesthetic normativity, the standards of co-evolved standards of beauty provide an evolutionary leverage which allow females to advance their freedom of choice in the face of persistent sexual violence. So anything the female can do, either behaviorally or anatomically, to reinforce her own freedom of choice will be rewarded by other females who will find her offspring more attractive, right? And I'll be tomorrow giving the details, mathematical details of that work. So sexual autonomy is not just a political concept invented by suffragettes and feminists, but a scientific fact of the life of social sexual species other than humans. Now, I consider this to be a profoundly feminist discovery in science. And not feminist in the way of taking political concepts and using them to adopt a science, but the kind of discovery that primary concerns of social relations and political relations in humans are actually broader than that and have direct analogs in the animals. Now, the arms race in ducks is unfortunate. It leads to increased investment by both males and females. Females are killed in the process. That skews the sex ratio toward more males, increases the unpaired males, which increases the incidence of sexual coercion, right? So it's not a pretty sight. However, there are other kinds of interesting birds that show other paths and that were actually really instructive for me. And one of them, the best example, I think, is the bowerbird. And in bowerbirds, the punchline here is that bowerbirds are using choice to avoid an arms race, right, in an interesting way. So the bowerbird is another polygynous bird, another aesthetic extremist, right? The females do all the nesting, and the males do displays. They don't aggregate, but they build this kind of a structure. It's not a nest. It's a kind of seduction theater, right? And it has only one seat, right? And where the female visits. And the species aggregate material. So in satin bowerbird, it's all about blue. And this avenue bower is decorated in the front with blue objects, like this blue feather, but also the photographers can't help themselves but bring blue straws and other trash. So if you get anywhere near where photographers are, you'll see trash, blue trash with these guys. This is another bowerbird that builds an avenue, the great bowerbird. This is from Prum in northwestern Australia, about 2 kilometers from the ocean. And on the ocean is a cliff. And in the middle of the cliff is a special stratum. And in that stratum are fossils. And so these are all fossil clamshells. Now, as a museum curator myself, I actually really relate to this invertebrate paleontological bowerbird, right, who's curating his fossil collection right here. And so when he's singing at the top of the tree in the morning, as he will do to try to attract females, he's actually saying, "Do you want to come over and see my fossil collection?" Right? Now that's the male, but that's where the female sits. And when they display, the male comes out front, like this male, and delivers quite dramatic, actually somewhat aggressive and scary display. He jumps, he flaps his wings, he makes mechanical sounds, and he also imitates lots of other birds, including kookaburra, right there at intimate distance. But the female is sitting right in the bower, right there, looking at him very closely. And now comes the feature, the special feature of bowers. If the male wants to copulate, he's got to go around the back of the walls, which gives her an opportunity, if she doesn't like what she sees, to pop out the front. So the bower is clearly aesthetic. It's clearly ornamented. It has architecture, but the architecture has other features, right? The feature is that it protects her freedom of choice. She cannot be coercively copulated, right? Now, interestingly, the male makes the bower because she likes it. She's selecting on him and his ornaments. But he makes the bower as she prefers it, the one that makes her comfortable. So this is a way in which females have used mate choice to transform maleness into a new form that meets her needs, which are aesthetics. You know, she's able to sit there at this intimate distance and look at all of his stuff as long as she likes and move on if she wants to, right? So this is what I call aesthetic remodeling, the way of using mate choice to transform maleness into a form that furthers sexual autonomy of females, right? Now, if we look at other kinds of bower architectures, they have the same function. This is the maypole, which is a whole other clade, maypole bowers, right? It has this kind of Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And lots of different things, blueberries and ornaments. And actually, they hang caterpillar frass, caterpillar poop all over this tree, right? Go figure. Anyway, so the female is standing one place and the male in the other. If the male comes around, then the female just moves. So they keep the tree between them. So this has the same feature of protecting her freedom of choice, right? So now we ask, what do female bowerbirds do with their freedoms of choice? Well, the answer is they pick beauty. And the result is an enormous aesthetic radiation through the elaboration and the establishment of freedom of choice, right? And so now we're at the point where we're making the scientific conclusion that freedom of choice begets beauty in nature, right? And that is a position in science I never imagined that I would be at, that has been opened up by the aesthetic in a new way. Now, in any kind of aesthetic competition, you can be guaranteed that the extremity prize will go to the Brazilian team. So, yeah, even though they lost in the World Cup, they still have the most beautiful team, I believe. This is the Cheirozyphia manakins, blue manakin. I want to point out that the female is right over here. So she's observing a team of males. This is a kind of special kind of cooperative lek, where this territory is essentially the property or owned by one alpha male. And then there's a beta male and a gamma male and all these other guys. And when the female, if she actually decides to mate or prefers this group, then the alpha male will give a call and all the other guys step aside and he is the only one that mates. So what are the other guys helping for? It turns out they're helping in someday maybe inheriting the perch. So this is like the biggest, sort of sexual airplane scheme ever, right? And it takes them 5 years to get into this plumage to begin with. And these relationships last for more than a decade, right? So this is the most extreme kind of sexual cooperation in nature. How the hell would this evolve? Well, there's been really good research by David McDonald on another species, where we see lots of these are network diagrams showing who danced with whom and who had sexual success, right? And so to make a long story short, he showed that network centrality is the best predictor of sexual success. That is, it's not about dominance, it's about how many friends you have and how well connected your friends are, right? So I call this bromance before romance, right? Females are selecting on males that get along. Why? Because of the aesthetic stimulus it gives them, right? And males have no other choice. They don't contribute anything to reproduction but sperm, and the females have freedom of choice, right? And so as a result, you get this elaborate kind of cooperation. That's an extraordinary kind of aesthetic remodeling. So I think lekking in general and these displays are examples of that. Well, I hope I've been able to argue for the productivity and aesthetic view of nature. I've already gone over long, but I've got you trapped here, and I've come all the way to, they'll go to 3 more minutes. Now, the last third of the book, and this really is selling the book, the last third of the book is about human evolution, human sexuality. And as an ornithologist, I never thought I would get here, but here I am. It was like low-hanging fruit, I just had to do it, and it was important. So, but I've spent, decades lecturing about sex lives of birds. What am I going to put on this slide? God help us, video or picture, I don't know, right? So I'm going to rely on my old pal, the professorial bullet point list, right? Okay, so human sexuality in 3 minutes, right? First, it's complicated. That's right, it's complicated because we have every mechanism, every evolutionary mechanism occurring. You have male choice and female choice. Male competition and female competition. You have sexual coercion involving in male coercion and female coercion. And then on top of that, you have culture, right? So there is no species on the planet with so as complicated as we are. And that means that getting this conversation right takes time and carefulness. There's so many ways to disagree as people talk about different levels. Second, it's important that Wallacean view has infected human culture, has infected culture today. So that I think that teenagers grow up today imagining, as they look at themselves in the mirror as teenagers inevitably will, they'll imagine that every variance, every difference, every quirk is somehow telling the world about their internal genetic quality. And this idea is bunk. It's been failing in biology, and it's certainly failing in humans. So I'm really hoping that someday young people will grow up in a world where they realize that they are responsible to become sexual subjects, not just sexual objects, to develop in their own sense of what it is that you want, and to realize you have an evolved history to obtain it, right? Secondly, it's aesthetic. The adaptive concepts do very poorly if it's driving ours. And then it's pleasurable. One of the things that happened in evolutionary science, going back to the Victorian era, there was an anxiety to talk about sex and sexual pleasure, right? Which led to this kind of distance from the topic. But then that distance, that anxious remove, became standardized as the objective stance of science, leaving evolutionary science with no language to talk about pleasure. So there is an entire chapter in the book on the evolution of orgasm, which everybody will want to read. Right? And then I propose in the book that aesthetic remodeling, that Bowerbird mechanism, is a key feature of the evolution of human beings. It's how we got here. Right? And I'll just talk about one aspect of that. What aesthetic deweaponization applies to teeth. It turns out that our immediate ancestors, males, have deadly weapons in their faces that human males lack. And the question is, how do you get males to give up their weapons? Well, that's a potent political debate in America today. Right? Well, the evolutionary answer is you make them unsexy. Right? And so I think actually that the smile evolved as a symbol of de-weaponization, right? Anyway, so, and then finally, human sexual attraction is diverse, right? Any natural history of human sexuality will have to deal with the diversity of sexual attraction. And I think that evolutionary biology up until today has done a very poor job of that. So there's a chapter titled The Queering of Homo sapiens that talks about the evolution of same-sex attraction in human beings from an aesthetic and sexual conflict perspective. So I think this is a field that I hope will lead to a new relation between evolutionary biology, feminism, and really queer theory and gender studies. So I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about the book. Thank you very much. And sorry for being over time.